There is a moment that arrives silently after all the noise fades. The kind of moment that feels like standing in a quiet room after the music stops, like the stillness that follows a long storm. In that hush, when the distractions disappear and no one is left to impress, something unfamiliar begins to surface. You're left with nothing but your own reflection. No audience, no applause, no mask to wear, just you. And for a while, you don't know what to do with that. Because for so long, your life has been about doing, performing, managing impressions, becoming who you were supposed to be. But now the question becomes unavoidable. Beneath it all, who are you? You try to answer with titles, with roles, with accomplishments. You say, I'm a parent, I'm a professional, I'm a helper. But something inside you shakes its head. That's not what it's asking. So you say, I'm strong, I'm loyal, I'm dependable. Again, the feeling stirs. It's not looking for labels. It wants what's raw, what's true. The version of you that exists when there is no one to impress, no expectation to meet, no fear shaping your words. That question is calling you inward, deeper than you've dared to go in a long time. It feels uncomfortable at first. You want to run, to scroll, to call someone, to clean something. Anything but face the space inside you that has gone untouched. But this time, you don't run. This time you stay. You let the silence sit with you. You allow the discomfort to speak, and slowly, you begin to notice the layers, the parts of yourself you left behind in order to be loved, the words you swallowed to keep the peace, the dreams you buried so others could shine, the needs you silenced because they felt too loud, too inconvenient, too much. And as these parts come into view, you realize just how much of yourself you've been hiding, not from others, but from yourself. You begin to feel the grief of self-abandonment, not all at once, but like slow waves. The sadness of watching yourself shrink in the presence of those who couldn't see you. The pain of giving your love where it wasn't reciprocated. The exhaustion of performing a version of happiness while carrying a storm in your chest. You cry, not because you're broken, but because you're remembering. And remembering hurts, but it also heals, because now, for the first time, you're telling the truth. Not the version you give others, the real one, the one you whisper into pillows, the one you carry in your bones. And as you tell that truth, something miraculous begins to happen. You feel lighter, not because the pain is gone, but because it's no longer pretending. You feel stronger, not because you've conquered anything, but because you've stopped running. You feel whole, not because everything makes sense, but because you stop needing it to. You realize that the journey back to yourself doesn't require you to become someone new. It asks you to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. You start seeing the patterns with new eyes, how you were taught to equate worth with productivity, how love felt conditional, how silence became a survival tactic. You see how often you minimized your joy so others wouldn't feel small, how you tiptoed around your truth to avoid being misunderstood. And instead of judging yourself for these patterns, you feel compassion, because those patterns were protection. They kept you safe. But now safety looks different. Now safety means being real. You stop demanding healing to look like happiness. You stop measuring growth by how good you feel. You understand that real healing looks like allowing all of it. The grief, the rage, the hope, the joy. That growth often feels like loss. That becoming whole sometimes requires falling apart. And in that surrender, in that willingness to meet yourself where you are, you find something deeper than peace. You find presence, the kind that doesn't need a reason, the kind that says, this moment is enough. I am enough. And when you look around at your life, you begin to see it differently. Not through the lens of lack, but through the lens of clarity. You start asking, does this align with who I'm becoming? You stop chasing things that once held your self-worth hostage. You release relationships that only knew the version of you that was always giving. You set boundaries not to punish, but to protect your peace. You make space, not just in your calendar, but in your soul. Space to feel, to rest, to remember. And in that space, you begin to hear a new voice, not the voice of fear or doubt or obligation, but the voice of your soul, the one that speaks in whispers, in nudges, in quiet knowing, the one that says, "This way," the one that never shames, never rushes, never demands. You listen, you lean in, you follow, even when it doesn't make sense, because now you trust it. You trust yourself, not because you figured everything out, but because you finally learned to stay. You stop needing to be fixed. You realize that you were never broken, only buried. Beneath the mask, beneath the performance, beneath the fear, you were always there, whole, worthy, sacred. You start seeing yourself through gentler eyes. You speak to yourself like someone you love. You apologize to yourself for the times you abandoned your own heart, and then you promise, never again. Never again will you silence your truth to make someone else comfortable. Never again will you push past your limits to earn someone's approval. Never again will you make yourself small so others can feel big. You begin to rebuild, not from desperation, but from devotion. You create rituals, not routines. You find joy in the ordinary. You walk more slowly. You notice your breath. You say thank you to the parts of your body that still carry you. You light a candle not for productivity, but for presence. You cook meals with your hands and your heart. You laugh more, deep, belly laughs that feel like freedom. You cry without apology. You rest without guilt. You are no longer striving for perfection. You are embodying presence. You are no longer seeking applause. You are seeking truth. And your truth, it's enough. Your tears are enough. Your stillness is enough. Your joy, your pain, your becoming, it's all enough. And in that enoughness, you bloom. Not for the world to see, not for anyone else's validation, but for yourself. You bloom because you were born to. You realize now that the greatest love story is the one you have with yourself. That your healing is not a performance, but a practice. That your softness is not a liability, but a compass. That your life is not a race, but a rhythm. And you begin to dance to your own beat. You stop comparing your journey. You stop rushing your process. You honor your timing, your pace, your becoming. You are not here to impress. You are here to be, to breathe, to love, to live fully, freely, authentically. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. There comes a day, almost unexpectedly, when the life you once fought so hard to keep no longer feels like it belongs to you. It's not dramatic. It doesn't always arrive with thunder or a collapse. Sometimes it's just an awareness, a sudden stillness in your chest while you sip your morning coffee. You look around and the silence says more than any conversation ever could. You've outgrown it, not in arrogance, not in resentment, but in truth. The habits, the pace, the relationships, the conversations, they don't fit anymore. You've changed. And for the first time, you're ready to stop apologizing for it. You stand at the edge of your old self, and even though part of you wants to cling to what is familiar, you know, deep in your bones, that something else is calling. You don't yet know what it is. You can't name it. You don't have a plan, but you have a feeling. A knowing that the life you're meant to live is not built from the pieces of the one that kept you small. And that realization, it doesn't scare you like it used to, because now you understand that letting go doesn't mean losing. It means making room. You begin clearing out, gently, deliberately, not with rage, but with reverence. You thank the people who once held space for your becoming, even if they no longer can. You close the chapters, not because they were wrong, but because you've written all the words they had to offer. You release the roles that asked you to deny your needs, your voice, your truth. You no longer perform the version of you that was easy for others to digest. You let her rest. You let her return to the soil from which something truer will grow. And in that letting go, you meet yourself more honestly than you ever have. You begin to see the parts of you that stayed quiet for too long, hoping to be invited in, the desires that waited patiently, the voice that learned to whisper so it wouldn't be too loud. You feel the ache of neglect, not from others, but from yourself. And it breaks your heart in the most necessary way. Because now you get to choose. You get to turn toward what you once turned away from. You get to say, I see you, I'm listening, I'm here. You stop abandoning yourself in rooms where your truth feels too heavy. You stop watering yourself down to make others feel more comfortable. You stop settling for crumbs and calling it love. You stop betraying your intuition for the sake of fitting in. You stop waiting for permission to be who you already are. And instead, you start honoring the quiet revolutions happening inside you. The soft stirrings, the inner shifts, the rising of your own voice. It's not always loud, this transformation. It's often gentle, quiet, slow. You begin to notice what you need, not in theory, but in practice. You feel when you're overwhelmed and give yourself space. You sense when your energy is being drained and you step away. You recognize the subtle signs your body sends and you trust them. You speak more kindly to yourself, not because you're trying to be positive, but because you've realized you are worthy of tenderness. You begin to experience rest differently, not as something you earn, but as something you deserve. You let your body soften. You let your breath slow. You stop measuring your days by how much you accomplished and start asking, did I stay connected to myself? That becomes the new marker of success. Not perfection, not performance, but presence. And as your presence deepens, so does your discernment. You see more clearly now. You feel when a space is nourishing or depleting. You sense when a conversation is adding or taking away. You stop doubting what your body already knows. You trust the signals. You honor the wisdom. You no longer need a long list of reasons to leave what no longer serves you. Your peace is enough of a reason. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-giving. You stop seeking validation. Not because you don't care, but because you care differently now. You care about being aligned more than being liked. You care about truth more than image. You care about connection more than performance. And from that shift, your life begins to realign. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly, like the way light changes in a room when you open the curtains. You begin calling your energy back from the people you overinvested in, from the narratives that told you who you had to be, from the roles that kept you in boxes, from the fears that made you shrink. You gather all of that energy and pour it back into yourself, not selfishly, but sacredly. You use it to rebuild, to create a life that feels like your own, a life that honors your depth, your rhythm, your truth. You realize now that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about reclaiming what was forgotten. The parts of you that still believed in magic, the parts that still trusted the moon and the tides, the parts that still listened for meaning in the quietest moments. You find those parts and you begin to breathe life into them. You dance without needing a reason. You cry without needing to explain. You sit in silence without needing to fill it. You come home to yourself, not as an idea, but as a practice. And in that practice, you find peace. Not because everything is resolved, not because life is suddenly simple, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself. And that, more than anything else, changes everything. You become someone you trust, someone you can rely on, someone who holds space for the full spectrum of your being. You know your own patterns, your own triggers, your own truths, and you meet them with love. You stop chasing healing. You live it. You live it in the way you open your heart to the moment, in the way you say no without guilt, in the way you choose joy without justification, in the way you allow your sadness to sit beside your joy. You no longer see emotions as problems. You see them as visitors, messengers, invitations to go deeper. And you go, not with fear, but with reverence, with curiosity, with grace. You let the old fall away, not because you hate it, but because it's complete. You shed layers, not to become someone else, but to reveal who you've always been. You live slower, softer, braver. You are no longer chasing a version of yourself. You are becoming her. The world doesn't understand that version of you. Maybe some people fall away. Maybe some doors close, but you no longer fear that. because you know that what is meant for your truth will never ask you to lie. What is meant for your soul will never ask you to shrink. So you walk forward, not with a blueprint, but with a compass, not with a 5-year plan, but with a present moment awareness. You trust the unfolding. You let the unknown be a friend, not a threat. And you keep becoming, not perfectly, not quickly, but fully, freely, authentically, because that's all you've ever needed to be. There is a kind of freedom that doesn't announce itself with fanfare or celebration. It comes quietly, in the smallest shifts, in the moment you say no when you used to say yes out of fear, in the silence you no longer feel obligated to fill, in the breath you finally take without apologizing for the space it occupies. This freedom is not about rebellion or resistance, it's about permission. The permission to be yourself, not as a statement or performance, but as a way of existing. It is the kind of freedom that doesn't seek to be noticed. It seeks to be felt, lived, embodied. Your world didn't matter, but now you've stopped because it suddenly became easy, but because it became unbearable to keep doing it. You start listening, not to the opinions swirling around you, but to the quiet, intuitive voice inside. You stop asking everyone else what they think. You stop needing others to validate what you already know deep down. Doing that, not because you begin to trust your body when it reacts. You notice how your chest tightens when you're betraying yourself, how your stomach churns when you're ignoring your truth. You no longer force yourself to push through. You no longer ignore those signals. You treat them as sacred. You treat them as wisdom. And when you do that, life begins to feel different. Not easier necessarily, but more honest. You stop lying to yourself about how things make you feel. You admit when you're tired, when you're resentful, when you're grieving. You tell the truth, not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. Because you've learned that authenticity is more nourishing than approval. You're no longer interested in pretending you're okay just to avoid discomfort. You know now that the discomfort of being real is softer than the ache of pretending. You begin holding space for your own humanity. You no longer expect yourself to be a machine. You don't berate yourself for being overwhelmed. You don't demand constant productivity. You rest when you need to. You breathe when you forget how. You forgive yourself over and over for the years you spent abandoning your own needs. You stop looking at your softness as a flaw. You begin to see it for what it really is, a power that's been misunderstood. You understand now that softness is not weakness. It's resilience with an open heart. And because you treat yourself with more compassion, you become less reactive to others. You're no longer triggered by the same things. You don't need to defend yourself all the time. You don't need to prove your worth in every interaction. You know who you are. You've sat with your shadows and you've stopped fearing them. When someone misunderstands you now, you don't spiral. You don't go into panic. You simply recognize that not everyone will get you, and that's okay. You don't owe the world your constant explanation. You owe yourself your peace. That peace begins to redefine what you value. You no longer chase after relationships that require you to perform. You no longer bend over backwards for people who only love the version of you that is easy, convenient, or entertaining. You look for connection that feels like rest, like truth, like home. You seek out spaces where your depth isn't shamed, where your silence isn't seen as distance, where your growth is celebrated and not resented. You want realness now, even if it's rare, even if it means being alone more often, because being alone in your truth is far less lonely than being surrounded by people who don't see you. And with this shift, you begin to realize how little you actually need to feel whole. You stop measuring your worth by how much you do, how many people like you, how productive your days are. You begin to value slowness. You start enjoying time by yourself. You find beauty in simplicity, in long walks, in deep breaths, in soft music, in morning light on your skin. You stop trying to fill every moment with distraction. You let silence become a friend instead of a threat. You begin to discover that there is a whole world within you, one that you've ignored for far too long. You visit that world often now. You journal not to perform but to connect. You meditate not to escape but to listen. You light candles for no reason. You cry without needing a story to justify the tears. You rest your head against the window and watch the clouds pass, feeling something close to peace, close to return. You're no longer rushing toward a version of yourself that someone else told you to become. You're walking slowly, back to the self you left behind. And every time you take a step, she smiles, because she never gave up on you. And the more you return to her, the more you realize that you don't need a grand transformation. You don't need to become a new person. You just need to be more you, more honest, more present, more whole. The parts you tried to fix weren't broken, they were just buried. The dreams you abandoned weren't childish, they were sacred. The feelings you pushed down weren't dramatic, they were divine communication. You stop fixing, you start listening, you start remembering. And from this remembering, your life begins to shift. You no longer need to grasp so tightly. You let go more easily. You stop forcing what doesn't feel right. You trust the no's. You respect the doors that close. You allow life to take things away from you, knowing that it is clearing space for what's aligned. You no longer attach your worth to outcomes. You no longer fear rest. You no longer shame your process. You are becoming someone who walks with more grace, not because you have all the answers, but because you've learned to be okay with the questions. You've stopped trying to control the unknown. You've started trusting that you will be okay no matter what. And that trust, it changes everything. You are no longer holding your breath, waiting for life to begin. You are exhaling into the life that's already here. And in that exhale, you bloom. And now you smile differently. Not the smile that seeks approval, but the smile that says, I'm home. You move differently. Not with urgency, but with intention. You love differently. Not from fear, but from fullness. You live differently, not to be seen, but to be felt by yourself. Because for the first time, that's who you're living for. You begin to understand that returning to yourself isn't a one-time decision. It's a practice, a sacred rhythm that asks you to come back again and again to what's real. It's not about staying there perfectly, endlessly, or without faltering. It's about noticing when you've drifted and gently guiding yourself back. There's no shame in the drift. There's no guilt in the forgetting. That's just part of the process. Because in truth, healing isn't linear, and neither is growth. Some days you're rooted in your truth, and some days you slip into the old patterns, the familiar stories. But even then, you hold more awareness now. Even then, you return faster, with more tenderness, more grace, more softness. You begin to accept that nothing outside of you will ever fully complete you. Not a relationship, not a career, not a certain number in your bank account or on a scale. You may feel fulfilled, supported, deeply grateful, but not completed, because you were never incomplete. You were always whole. You just forgot. You forgot every time you handed your worth to something outside of yourself. You forgot every time you believed the lie that said you had to be more, do more, give more in order to be worthy. But now you're remembering, you're pulling your worth back. Piece by piece, breath by breath. You no longer chase things from a place of lack. You pursue them from a place of alignment. You ask yourself not, what will they think? But how does this feel in my body? You lead with sensation, not image. With integrity, not performance. You've stopped curating your life for external validation. You're curating it for truth, for peace, for presence. And in that shift, you realize how much more sustainable everything becomes. There's no longer a high to chase, no finish line to reach. Just this moment, and then the next, and then the next. You begin to see how much of life is built on illusion, the illusion of control, the illusion of certainty, the illusion of linear paths. And when those illusions begin to crumble, you don't panic the way you used to. You breathe, you hold space, you let go. Because now you understand that peace isn't found in control, it's found in surrender. And surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means softening your grip, releasing the belief that you must force things into being, trusting that what's meant for you won't miss you, trusting that your path is unfolding in the timing that's right for your soul, even if it doesn't match the timeline you once created in your mind. You begin to slow down, not because you have to, but because you want to. Because slowness feels safe now. It feels like clarity. It feels like presence. You're no longer rushing from one thing to the next. You're savoring, sipping life like warm tea instead of chugging it like water in a desert. You pay attention to the way your breath feels in your chest, to the way the light shifts in the sky, to the way your heart opens when you hear certain words. You are present, not perfectly, but deeply. And that presence, it changes everything because it allows you to actually feel your life instead of just think about it. You start living with more intention. You don't fill your schedule just to feel important. You don't say yes just to avoid conflict. You no longer fear the discomfort that honesty may bring. You welcome it. You know that truth sometimes stings before it soothes, that freedom often requires letting go, that love is not always comfortable, but it is always clarifying. So you stop running from clarity even when it hurts, even when it means loss, even when it invites solitude. You stop fearing solitude too. You've come to love your own company. You've come to see that solitude isn't the absence of connection, it's the deepening of it, the refinement, the clarity, the return. You begin to make decisions based not on what looks good on paper, but what feels good in your soul. You turn down opportunities that once made your ego light up. You walk away from people who still want the old version of you. You simplify, you release. You don't make yourself wrong for wanting less noise, fewer opinions, deeper connections. You no longer entertain chaos just to feel alive. You've redefined aliveness. Now it feels like breath, like presence, like a body that doesn't ache from tension, like a mind that's not at war with itself, like moments that don't need to be documented to be remembered. You stop performing joy and start feeling it. And your joy, it's different now. It's quieter, more grounded, less of a high, more of a hum. It lives in your morning rituals, in your evening stillness, in the texts that feel like truth, in the music that pulls tears from your eyes, in the laughter that comes unexpectedly. You find joy in the softness, in the space, in the simplicity. And because your joy is no longer borrowed from others, it's no longer dependent on what they think, say, or do. You've reclaimed it. You've made it yours. You don't need your life to be loud to feel meaningful. You don't need your days to be filled to feel fulfilled. You find magic in the mundane. You find beauty in what you once overlooked. You light candles for yourself. You dance in your kitchen. You read books without rushing to finish them. You cook meals with love. You find presence in the tasks you once rushed through. You see your life not as something to escape from, but as something to sink into, to cherish, to hold. And in holding your life this way, you start attracting more of what aligns. Not because you've mastered manifestation, but because your energy has changed. You're no longer signaling desperation. You're radiating wholeness. And wholeness is magnetic. People feel it. The right ones are drawn to it, the wrong ones are repelled by it. You don't need to chase anymore. What's meant for you recognizes you, and you recognize it too. Not because it checks boxes, but because it feels like home, like breath, like ease. You begin to live less from the mind and more from the heart, not recklessly, but reverently. You allow your feelings to inform you. You don't dismiss them as irrational. You stop trying to logic your way through your healing. You let your heart speak. You listen when it breaks. You honor what it longs for. You become fluent in the language of your own soul. You're no longer afraid of your depth. You're no longer afraid of your light. You've made peace with your shadow. You've stopped hiding your softness. You've stopped being ashamed of your strength. You know who you are now, not in the way that makes you rigid or certain, but in the way that makes you rooted and open. You know you'll keep changing, keep evolving, keep unfolding, and that excites you. You're no longer afraid of who you're becoming. You trust her, you support her, you hold space for her. You let her grow, because this life, it's yours now. Not in theory, in truth. You reach a point on the path where the old ways of living simply no longer fit. They begin to feel foreign, like clothes that once hugged your body just right, but now cling awkwardly to parts of you that have grown. The schedules, the habits, the conversations, the environments. You sense them like static in your energy. Not wrong, but misaligned. Not evil, but expired. You're not angry at them. You're just done trying to fit into something you've outgrown. There is a reverence in that awareness, a kind of quiet strength in choosing not to force what no longer feels like truth. Because when you've lived long enough inside a skin that no longer fits, peace becomes more valuable than familiarity. And so you start releasing, not with drama, not with declarations, but with a soft sigh, a slow closing of a door, a gentle turning inward. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. You stop chasing conversations that go in circles. You stop hoping people will meet you in your depth when they're still swimming in the shallow. You stop proving, stop performing, stop pretending. You no longer light yourself on fire to keep others warm. You no longer dilute your truth to be digestible. You speak with clarity. You walk with presence. You move with grace. And in that movement, you begin to build a new rhythm, not one shaped by obligation or urgency, but by inner guidance. You wake slowly. You don't rush into the day with a to-do list stamped across your forehead. You open your eyes and feel your breath. You stretch. You listen. You let the day greet you before you greet the world. You begin to understand that presence isn't something you schedule, it's something you choose, moment by moment, breath by breath. And in those moments, you reclaim your power, the kind that's not loud or dominant, but grounded, centered, sacred. You start living your life like a sacred offering, not because you've become religious or spiritual in the way others define it, but because you now understand that everything is energy. Everything you do, how you speak, how you eat, how you rest, how you connect, is a conversation with the universe, a prayer without words, a vibration, a message. And so you become intentional. You let your choices be slow. You let your presence be full. You don't rush through your rituals. You don't apologize for needing space. You don't explain your boundaries. You live like someone who knows that your time, your energy, your attention, they're holy. And something shifts in the way the world responds to you, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You don't draw people to you by effort. You attract them through embodiment. People feel the difference, not always consciously, but energetically. Some will draw closer, some will pull away. Both are gifts. You stop taking it personally. You realize that the version of you who was always bending, accommodating, overextending, that version attracted people who fed off your self-abandonment. But this version, the one who's rooted, soft, and clear, she only holds space for what nourishes her soul. There's something sacred that happens when you begin to see your own patterns without judgment. Not to shame yourself, not to scold or correct, but simply to witness, to understand, and to soften. It's in that witnessing where the healing deepens. When you pause in the middle of a familiar reaction and ask yourself gently, where is this coming from? Instead of attacking the feeling or suppressing it, you sit with it, you hold it, you let it speak. And often what it says is not anger or defiance, but fear, grief, longing. You start to see the truth underneath the triggers, and that changes everything. Because now you're not trying to fix yourself. You're trying to understand yourself. You're not trying to escape your shadows. You're learning how to stand beside them. You're not trying to outrun your pain. You're letting it be seen so it doesn't control you in silence. And in doing so, you become safer within your own skin. You become someone you can trust, someone you no longer abandon when the feelings get big or the moments get heavy. You stay. And staying with yourself, that is the truest form of love. You begin to rewrite your inner dialogue. The voice inside your mind that once mimicked old criticism, the one that repeated the voices of those who wounded you, starts to change tone. It begins to sound like your own voice now. Softer, wiser, more patient. You don't call yourself dramatic anymore. You don't shame yourself for crying. You don't berate yourself for not being over it yet. You say, of course you still feel this. It mattered. It shaped you. Let's sit with it. And something inside exhales, grateful to finally be allowed to feel without punishment. And in that feeling, you begin to reconnect with your emotional body in a way you never have. You realize that sadness doesn't mean something is wrong, That anger doesn't mean you're unspiritual. That confusion doesn't mean you're broken. These are simply signals, messengers, parts of your internal guidance system reminding you that something inside needs attention. You stop bypassing your emotions with affirmations that deny your reality. You stop rushing to gratitude before fully grieving. You honor the entire emotional spectrum as divine. You begin to see your own needs more clearly too, not as inconveniences or flaws, but as sacred data. When your body asks for rest, you don't guilt yourself out of it. When your heart wants solitude, you don't call yourself distant. When your spirit longs for play, you don't label it childish. You listen, you give, you trust that honoring your needs is not selfish. It's sacred stewardship of the one life you're living. And as you do, life begins to feel less like resistance and more like rhythm. You shift from urgency to intention. You stop overbooking yourself. You leave white space in your days for breathing, wandering, wondering. You no longer feel compelled to say yes just to avoid disappointing others. You know now that your no can be a full sentence, that your boundaries are not walls, they're bridges to connection built on truth. You don't expect others to read your mind. You express your needs with clarity, not codependency. And if they can't meet you there, you don't beg. You bless them and release. You stop giving from depletion. You don't pour from an empty cup anymore. You pour from overflow, from alignment, from authenticity. You give without losing yourself. You love without betraying your own heart. You show up fully but not beyond your capacity. You stop overextending, over-apologizing, over-explaining. You let your presence speak for itself, and it does, softly, powerfully, consistently. Because now your presence is rooted in truth, and truth, it becomes your compass. You stop seeking approval when your soul is at peace. You no longer need external applause to feel valid. You don't bend yourself into shapes to be accepted. You don't shrink to make others comfortable. You're not loud about it, but your energy speaks clearly. I am no longer abandoning myself to belong. And those who can meet you in that self-honoring space, they're your people. You recognize them not by their words, but by how your nervous system feels around them. Safe, seen, still. And from that safety, you begin to bloom. Not performatively, not dramatically, but gently, naturally. As flowers do when the sun reaches them, and they no longer have to fight to survive. You stop fighting too, not because life gets easier, but because your inner world becomes more peaceful. You meet challenges from a place of center now, not chaos. You meet change with curiosity, not fear. You meet yourself with grace, even when you falter, especially when you falter. You've let go of the need to have all the answers. You understand now that growth happens in questions, that presence matters more than perfection, that you don't need to have it all figured out to be on the right path. You trust your steps even when they feel shaky. You trust your process even when others can't see it. You trust your timing even when the world is moving faster. You are no longer sprinting towards some imagined destination. You're walking softly, consciously, home to yourself. And home, it begins to feel like an energy you carry. Not a location, not a relationship, not a future fantasy, but a felt sense of safety in your body, of ease in your heart, of clarity in your mind. You stop outsourcing your peace. You stop looking for someone else to hold what you're meant to hold. You've built an internal sanctuary, one that doesn't collapse when others leave, one that doesn't shake when the world does, one that is rooted in truth. And from that sanctuary, you live. You love more deeply now, not because you've been taught how, but because you've remembered how. You've cleared out the residue of survival love, the kind that clings, that begs, that fears. You know now that love doesn't demand you disappear, that true connection makes room for your fullness, that intimacy is not built through intensity, but through consistency. You don't confuse chaos for passion anymore. You don't romanticize being needed. You don't sacrifice your peace for proximity. You've raised the standard, not for others, but for yourself. And when someone rises to meet you there, it doesn't feel like magic. It feels like alignment. It feels like ease, like honesty, like respect. And when they can't meet you, it's not a tragedy, it's information. You don't take it personally. You don't try to become more digestible. You know that the ones meant for you will not require you to split yourself in half just to be held. You don't live from scarcity anymore. Not in love, not in opportunity, not in time. You know that what's meant for you is already on its way. You know that your only job is to remain in alignment, to stay true, to stay open, to stay grounded. You're no longer hustling for your worth. You're embodying it. You walk differently now, not with arrogance, but with certainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from deep self-respect. And maybe the world doesn't notice the changes right away. Maybe your progress isn't loud. Maybe your healing isn't visible. But you feel it in your breath, in your choices, in your boundaries, in your peace. And that's enough. That's more than enough. And in that nourishment, you bloom, not for attention, not for applause, but because blooming is what you were made to do. You stop delaying your joy. Stop waiting for everything to be perfect. Stop needing a reason to feel good. You let yourself smile on a Tuesday morning for no reason. You let yourself cry without needing to make sense of it. You stop filtering your emotions. You stop intellectualizing your healing. You live in your body now, not just your mind. And your body, she thanks you for it. She softens, she sighs, she opens. You find yourself speaking with more truth, not in ways that are sharp or confrontational, but in ways that are honest and clear. You say, "This doesn't feel right." You say, "I need more time." You say, "I can't hold this for you." And you let your no be as holy as your yes. You no longer need to over-explain. You no longer need to justify your intuition. You no longer need to make sense to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You trust your own voice now, not because it's always right, but because it's always yours. And that trust, it spills into everything. The way you move through uncertainty, the way you navigate change, the way you sit in silence without panicking. You no longer fill every space with noise. You no longer run from the void. You've learned that the void isn't emptiness, it's spaciousness. It's the room your soul needs to stretch, to expand, to listen. You stop fearing stillness. You welcome it. You let it become your sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, you meet parts of yourself you forgot existed. You remember the girl who used to dream without limits, the one who danced without mirrors, the one who spoke to trees and trusted her instincts, the one who believed in magic, not because someone told her to, but because she could feel it. And maybe she's older now. Maybe she's been bruised by life, but she's still in there, still whispering, still waiting. And now, finally, you're listening. You're inviting her back, not to lead from naivety, but to live with wonder again, to believe in beauty again, to believe in beauty again, to remember that the soul doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in feeling, in symbols, in synchronicity. And so you begin noticing the signs, the songs that play at just the right moment, the people who appear when you need them most, the gentle nudges, the deep knowing, the dreams that won't leave you alone. You stop calling them coincidence. You start calling them conversation. You stop seeking proof. You start trusting resonance. You live in alignment now, not with a doctrine, but with your own energy. You don't follow a map. You follow your inner compass. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to stay connected, stay aware, stay open. And as you open, you soften, not into weakness, but into wisdom. The kind of wisdom that doesn't need to shout, the kind that doesn't need to win, the kind that knows when to speak and when to stay silent, when to act and when to rest, when to hold on and when to let go. You begin to value that wisdom more than knowledge. You begin to lead with your heart, not just your head. And the world may not always understand that. But you're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be true to yourself. And in your truth, you are free. There's a certain kind of clarity that only arrives after you've spent enough time in the dark. Not the kind of darkness that comes from malice or danger, but the kind that settles in when everything familiar begins to fall away. When the masks are too heavy to wear and the expectations no longer feel worth meeting. It's in that still, uncomfortable space where you stop trying to be who you're not. You stop striving to maintain the image. You stop trying to outrun your truth. You find yourself stripped down, not broken, but raw, exposed, vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, something sacred begins to grow. You begin to recognize the weight you've been carrying. Not physical weight, but emotional. The kind you can't see in a mirror, but feel in your bones. The burden of always being strong, the pressure to keep it all together, the ache of holding emotions you didn't know how to name. You see now how long you've been moving through life on autopilot, chasing what you thought would make you whole. You realize how often you've looked for love through performance, for peace through control, for freedom through perfection. And you grieve, not because you were wrong, but because now you know better. Now you're ready to live differently. And living differently doesn't mean throwing everything away. It doesn't mean becoming someone new overnight. It means becoming more honest, more present, more intentional. It means pausing before you say yes, breathing before you react, asking yourself what you need before you give away your energy. It means choosing peace, even when chaos feels more familiar. It means softening, even when hardening would be easier. It means slowing down, not out of laziness, but out of respect for your own rhythm. Because now you understand, life isn't a race, it's a relationship. And you're no longer willing to abandon yourself to keep pace with a world that forgot how to feel. You start to feel everything more vividly. The joy, the sorrow, the longing, the hope. It all becomes more real, not because your circumstances have changed, but because you've stopped numbing. You've stopped avoiding. You've stopped turning your emotions into enemies. You no longer see your sadness as weakness. You see it as evidence that you're alive, that your heart still works, that you care deeply, and you do. You care deeply about the world, about the people around you, about yourself, and that caring, it becomes your compass, your anchor, your why. You begin to notice beauty in places you once overlooked, in the way the wind brushes your face, in the sound of your own laughter, in the warmth of your tea as you hold the mug between your palms. These moments, they aren't small anymore. They're sacred. They're what you've been missing while chasing the extraordinary. You've come to realize that you don't need a grand life to feel fulfilled. You need a meaningful one where you're present, one where your values lead, one where your heart has room to breathe. And so you make room. You clean out your life the way you would a cluttered room. You take inventory. You hold things up and ask, does this feel like love? Does this reflect who I am becoming? And if the answer is no, you let it go. Not with resentment, but with gratitude. Gratitude for what it taught you. Gratitude for what it revealed. Gratitude for the space it leaves behind. And in that space, something new begins to take root. Something that feels less like striving and more like belonging. You start choosing relationships that honor your growth, not ones that require you to shrink. You stop explaining your boundaries to those who don't respect them. You stop watering down your joy to make others comfortable.